In a world where life no longer belongs to humans, he woke up without a name, without memories. Who is he? Is he dead or alive? His existence is full of mysteries until he meets her. A sweet girl named Ruby. Their introduction began with him nearly getting shot. The zombie boy wasn't exactly welcomed by the people of Amin. They even kicked him out for murder, even though he had amazing physical abilities and incredible strength. But before the exile, bigger problems emerged. A masked psychopath started hunting the miracle boy, claiming they were brothers. Who is this lunatic? What does he want? Will anyone protect this child? Will he find his place in society? Will he understand his past? Two old friends will help him unravel this mystery. This is a story about how, even in a world where everything is dead, a heart can still beat. But is that enough to survive? Cold. An eerie silence, occasionally broken by a piercing wind with no people in sight. Amina, Zone 1. Wait, there's someone walking around. Are they being pushed by the wind? In these conditions, wandering the streets is risky. Every movement is caught by the camera's lens. Proof that it wasn't the end of the world yet. Not everyone was gone. But when the apocalypse begins, the scariest enemy becomes humans. The drone locked onto its target, with nothing standing in its way. Technology had advanced to the point where whoever had the best toys won. The target was visible from several angles, leaving no chance for survival. One silent, sharp, and almost invisible shot, and the poor soul was gone, minus an arm. Death was instantaneous. Bevrian did a fantastic job. Partner Ter couldn't stop raving about the new software that made their job easier. But Bevrian said it was too soon to celebrate. They needed to keep monitoring. He watched closely, blinking a few times. The drone spun around as if scanning the area. But everything seemed clear. Silence returned, no souls around, just the faint hum of the drone. The guys quickly got up and headed for the exit, with Bevrian leading the way. The drone, like a partner, moved closer with them. Tyre recognized the man with long hair and one missing arm. That was the scoundrel they'd been hunting. Zone 1 was finally safe, a month-long worry resolved. Suddenly, strange noises came from behind Tyre. It seemed Zone 1 had some contaminants, and it looked like this virus was waiting for a zombie to approach. At that moment, a device on Tyre's body beeped, signaling it was time for medication. His partner handed a bottle to Bevrian so he could take his meds too. After that, they had to move immediately. Staying in one place was dangerous. Tyre grinned widely, saying there weren't many left, so they could safely gather all the contaminants in Zone 1. Then he asked if Ruby would be pleased, but Bevrian couldn't be sure. Amina, the safe zone. On a rooftop, two young people watched the drone. One was a very pretty young girl with long blonde hair. She couldn't take her eyes off the drone on the neighboring roof. She seemed to be putting in a lot of effort, as evidenced by the sweat on her face. Then she closed her eyes, tensed up, and a blue rectangle glowed on her temples. The drone on the other roof immediately shot up into the air. Her partner praised Ruby, saying she did a great job. Now she had to slowly open her eyes. Then the drone started to tilt, and suddenly disaster struck. It darted forward, crashing from side to side. The drone was completely out of control. Her partner tried to calm Ruby, telling her not to worry, just close her eyes and let the drones land safely. His words helped as the drone finally went for a landing. Ruby collapsed to the ground, exhausted. She was so scared. What the heck? She couldn't control the drone with her eyes open, couldn't focus. Her dad was a pro at this. There were only two things Ruby needed to master: what she saw and what the drone saw. But how to focus? You'd need two brains for that. Her partner, Dune, found this amusing, as he was the complete opposite of Ruby. He struggled to control the drone if it went out of his sight. Ruby ordered him to take control of her drone too, but did she really think Dune couldn't handle his own? Despite his pride, he had to support his friend. If she kept practicing, she'd surely succeed. He'd told her this before, but what amazed him most was that Ruby could control the drone with her eyes closed. The conversation smoothly shifted to repainting the drone. It turned out Dune's dad loved the color blue, so he thought of using it for his device. Why did the info about Dr. Simon's favorite color amuse Ruby? Dune looked at his partner with a playful grin, as if he said it knowing she'd like it. He waited for the right moment to suggest Ruby try again. She focused, first closing her eyes, then gradually opening them. Before her, Ruby saw what the drone saw. Suddenly, she saw something that shouldn't be there. Ruby snapped her eyes open. Was she imagining things? No, it was definitely there. Someone was in the building. A few seconds passed since Ruby noticed the intruder, and she was already racing to the spot, Dune unable to catch up and stop her. Finally, he managed to grab Ruby's arm. What was she thinking? What if it was a zombie? But she insisted she was sure she saw a man there. They couldn't check with the drone because the zombies would hear it, rush to the sound, and that person would be in danger. Dune tried to calm her, saying it was loud during training too, but the zombies didn't hear anything. Ruby needed to think carefully about what she wanted to do, as Dune thought it was better to inform the adults. But Ruby interrupted him, saying she couldn't miss this chance. They had to save that man. Dune realized he couldn't convince her, so he just sighed and agreed. How could he refuse his Ruby? Ruby's drone buzzed quietly near the building. The teens hid nearby, watching. Ruby tried to focus. No more impulsive action, she waited. Suddenly, she finally saw the man. She saw the exact spot. With those words, Ruby immediately headed toward her discovery. Dune didn't even have time to stop her. Though Ruby seemed reckless, she never forgot about her safety. That's the first rule of survival. But in her mind, Ruby begged the stranger not to run. They could save him. She wanted it so badly. Ruby barely entered the building. When their eyes met, that pale skin was the first thing she noticed. Why did Ruby freeze? Was she wrong and it was a zombie? White hair, pale skin. If it wasn't a human, then it was an enemy. Without thinking, Ruby aimed her weapon at the stranger, ready for drastic measures. Suddenly, she heard a human voice, the boy pleading not to shoot, his voice trembling with fear. Either this was a new type of intelligent zombie, or it was indeed a human. When the boy realized he was still breathing and hadn't been shot, he finally opened his eyes. He was polite, first thanking them for not killing him. Ruby was silent, in shock, so the stranger continued, saying it was nice to see a human. At that moment, Dune burst in with a shout. His gaze was fixed on the stranger, who looked just like a zombie. Without thinking, Dune opened fire on the zombie. Ruby couldn't stop him. But luckily, Dune wasn't the best shot, and all the bullets missed the stranger, giving Ruby time to explain to her partner what happened. His body and hands began to tremble with the realization that he almost killed a living person. But Dune decided to ask again if it really wasn't a zombie. The stranger trembled just as much, his timid voice asking them to put the gun away. He was already doubting if he was human. Then Ruby intervened and calmed her partner. The stranger could finally breathe. It's hard to think when someone's shooting at you. Ruby finally remembered her manners, and that people don't usually start introductions with gunfire. So she introduced herself and asked the newcomer's name. But there was a little problem. He didn't remember his name. It turned out the stranger had lost his memory, but it didn't bother him since it didn't stop him from living a normal life. By the way, where had they moved to? Dune explained that this was their hideout, known to no one. But now the stranger was part of the secret. Ruby added that everyone should have a place to escape adult eyes. Suddenly, Dune noticed something odd. It seemed the newcomer didn't feel cold, but if he wasn't a zombie, he should be freezing in those clothes. The stranger agreed he felt cold, but shouldn't he be cold now? Before he could answer Dune's question, Ruby intervened, asking her partner not to bother the newcomer. She suggested they head to Amina before dark, as it was dangerous at night, and they needed to be cautious. Dune objected, saying Lisa wouldn't approve. Could they really take the newcomer with them? But he had no bite marks, and if Dune talked to his dad, he'd sort it out. Lisa? Ruby couldn't ignore the survivors. She couldn't do that. She had to show him to Lisa. They had to help the survivors. They moved to a large and beautiful building, Amina. Ruby peeked around the corner. Everything ahead was clear, so Ruby signaled the others to follow her. Dune followed, unaware that his partner knew a shortcut. He turned to ensure the newcomer was following them, but he didn't finish his sentence due to the newcomer's strange reaction, who was looking around with great fascination. Meanwhile, Ruby approached the door. She placed her hand on the lock, which made a confirming sound, and the door opened with the newcomer right beside her. He entered first, still amazed by Ruby's room. Dune said he'd bring some food while they settled in. Ruby wanted to say something to the newcomer, but suddenly fell silent mid-sentence. She couldn't help but be amazed by his reaction to everything he saw, as if the stranger had lived in a basement all his life and never seen the light. Ruby didn't disturb him, but suggested he sit down. He must be tired. That wasn't the case, but she persuaded him to sit, as he needed to come up with a name. The blonde cheerfully jumped onto the bed, a smile never leaving his face. He kept his eyes on Ruby, and after a pause, he asked what would happen next. She hadn't realized she'd been silent for so long. His unusual appearance was so captivating. Ruby couldn't look away, but then she suddenly felt embarrassed and started speaking awkwardly, just to cover herself. She suggested Tung Tung, but even though he lost his memory, he knew that name wasn't human at all. Then Ruby came up with a few more options. TT, Ro, Rara. Was she teasing? But Ruby wasn't joking. It was easy to remember and pronounce, and it was cute. But Roro, Titi, or Rara was thinking about something else entirely. Something suddenly intrigued him. His hand reached for Ruby's face, moving the hair that covered her cheek, and he saw. Ruby froze. She didn't expect him to do that. Her own helplessness in that moment was infuriating. Finally, she snapped out of her daze. Ruby swatted away the intruder's hand and hid behind her hair even more. He wanted to say something, but she immediately denied it, anticipating his question. "No, it wasn't a bite. It was a burn," Ruby shouted. But it seemed the stranger didn't understand what she was talking about, as evidenced by his confused expression. Then he finally got it and started denying everything, searching for something in his bag. After which he handed Ruby a photo. What beauty! It turned out to be a picture of very beautiful flowers, and Ruby's scar resembled them. It turned out there was a room with walls covered in flower photos. The blonde thought he could stay in that room for about a week because it felt good. There were so many photos, but he took the one he found most beautiful. Suddenly he blushed, saying the burn on Ruby's face looked like flowers, and he thought it was beautiful. Now Ruby was blushing with embarrassment, just as Dune entered, shocked. He brought food, and the blonde was starving and didn't care what he ate. Dune's attention shifted to Ruby, who was acting very strangely. Before he could ask what happened, his partner had already fled, saying she wanted to find some clothes. The door slammed shut, but Ruby didn't rush to leave. She was gathering herself. It was the first time someone said her scars were beautiful and compared them to flowers. Her heart was racing. Dune was in a stupor, so he asked what happened. The blonde guessed it was because he saw the burns on her face. After Dune's explanation, it turned out Ruby was very sensitive, as there were many instances where people thought it was a zombie bite. So she didn't like her scars. The blonde couldn't have imagined such a thing, but now it was clear why Ruby hid her face behind her hair. He decided to apologize later, after which he took a spoonful of the soup they brought him. Suddenly a strong nausea hit his throat, and he couldn't help himself. He had to spit it out. Dune couldn't believe it was that bad. He had tried it himself, but he decided to check again. However, it wasn't just edible, it was actually tasty, though a bit bland. The blonde said maybe it was because he hadn't eaten hot food in a long time. Dune didn't pay attention, just asked him to eat because the newcomer needed to adjust to this now. Then he lay down to nap, asking to be woken when Ruby returned. She was just returning to the room with a pile of clothes. Only then did Ruby realize she hadn't even asked for his size, but she took as much as she could. Better too big than too small. Ruby entered the room expecting nothing unusual. Suddenly she fell silent. Her body froze. She couldn't move. Because in front of her was Dune. Her Dune, who now looked like a zombie, and only a small patch of red hair reminded her that he was once her friend. Understanding of what happened and what she saw before her dawned on Ruby. She called out to Dune, still not believing it was her friend who had become a zombie. But instead of a response, the monster just opened its mouth to bite Ruby. The newcomer saved her from death, grabbing Dune at the last moment. While the zombie struggled to break free, the blonde ordered Ruby not to stand there like a statue, but to at least close the door. But she couldn't do anything. Her body wouldn't obey. It seemed like time had frozen, and there was a noise in her head. Suddenly her hands started to tremble. No! No, no, no! This can't be happening! Finally, Ruby couldn't take it and screamed loudly. It was a cry of despair. Suddenly, someone pulled her shoulder from behind. It was Ter, and Beverian moved forward, ordering everyone to step back. He pulled a weapon from his pocket, and tears welled up in Ruby's eyes. She knew what was about to happen, but her heart was breaking with pain. Dune, sensing his imminent end, went berserk. He started screaming and thrashing. Beverian didn't think. He acted mechanically, like a robot. Ruby's heart raced so fast it felt like it would leap out. She screamed, she protested. Then a loud shot rang out, and then silence. The newcomer was in shock and fear, worried he'd be shot too, but he seemed to be breathing. But he couldn't rejoice for long, as the sound of a gun cocking was heard immediately. Bevrian's expression made it clear. He wouldn't hesitate, and any hint of something would lead to death. But he was distracted from another killing. Lisa arrived with another man. They heard the shot and rushed over. She peeked into the room. The first thing she saw was a pool of blood. Her pupils widened sharply. She knew well what it meant. Lisa's voice became harsh and stern, but it was clear she was hiding pain as she asked Ruby if she was satisfied. Was this what she wanted? Then she ordered her partner to thoroughly disinfect the room and not let anyone leave the building. Next in line was the newcomer. All blame placed on him. Lisa knew he was the cause of all this. She ordered the room to be searched and him to be taken away, avoiding eye contact with his child. The newcomer was led out of the room, his eyes searching for Ruby. But she didn't even look, her face hidden by her hair, but her tears were visible. So he lowered his eyes too, genuinely sorry, but he didn't know what happened or why he was blamed. Ruby didn't turn to him, even though she knew he was passing by. Dune wasn't breathing. He really became a zombie, and there was no saving him. Lisa barely held back tears. She'd never see Simon again, and now he'd let his son go, just like he let him go. Bevrian! She wouldn't just stand by, even if this time it was his daughter. Lisa asked if Bevrian agreed. But it wasn't a question, it was more of an order. His daughter turned their efforts to ashes, and this was the third time. Had he forgotten why their hope was shattered? Ruby was no longer a child. Bevrian had to stop covering for her. Lisa suggested he tell his daughter how her mother died, threatening to do it herself if he stayed silent. Suddenly, Lisa's voice softened a bit, saying it would be better for Ruby if he told her himself. Bevrian was silent, knowing not only his daughter lost her mother, but he lost the love of his life, and Lisa knew it well. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another room. There, Ter told Ruby she should have told him first, and he would have helped for sure. But the girl didn't respond. He tried to support her, asking her not to worry too much, as he and her father were with her. Ruby was silent, unable to stop blaming herself for what happened, anger gradually filling her entire being. Suddenly, Ter's device beeped, requesting him to come to the conference room. He replied he'd be there soon. Then he offered more words of support to Ruby, but warned he'd have to lock this room, and she'd have to stay there for a while, not in her own. As he left, he said he loved his niece. Ruby remained silent, but the door closed anyway. When her uncle left, she stood up. Conference room? The girl looked around the room and noticed the ventilation. The scene shifted to the conference room. As expected, Dune was infected because of that child. It turned out he lost all color. His body died like any other zombie, but mentally he was completely normal. Ter was immediately interested, as they could make a vaccine if it was immunity. Lisa didn't hide that she initially thought the same, but the boy's body was dead, as she had already said. They couldn't find even the slightest hint of a vaccine in his body. Then Lisa showed footage from a camera showing exactly how Dune got infected. Everyone expected to see a bite or some abnormal behavior. But what they saw left the men speechless. They couldn't believe their eyes. That boy, he was much more dangerous than zombies, because regular zombies could only infect through bites, but this one was dangerous with just his saliva. He was mentally stable, which was the worst part. This made him a walking infection. So what was left to do, you ask? Ter suggested putting the boy back on the street. But that was a bad plan, as they needed to be sure there wouldn't be more infected people. So, Lisa said they would kill him. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another room, where he sat alone. 5 hours ago, the poor soul sentenced to death had fallen asleep at the table. He was awakened by a sudden pounding on the door. He turned and saw Dune. What the? The boy was terrified. His heart raced. He was confused, forgetting he should run, but he started shouting, trying to calm Dune, even though he was already a zombie. And dead. Dune got very close, practically breathing in his face. The boy held him back as best he could, but he didn't understand what this madman was doing or what he wanted. Then there was a brief pause when Dune stopped getting so close, just stood there as if thinking or listening. And then he just turned around and walked away. What was that? How could a dead zombie still be around? All these questions spun in the boy's mind. Events flashed back to that room where he replayed what happened, unable to grasp why Dune hadn't even attacked him. Suddenly, a loud crash interrupted his thoughts. Ruby fell from the ceiling. She appeared so suddenly and skillfully, as if crawling through ventilation shafts was second nature to her. He wanted to ask a million questions, but Ruby wasn't listening. She immediately handed him his clothes and bag. The blonde reminded her there were cameras in the room, but she had it all figured out. The camera would show him sitting there for 10 minutes. Without waiting for a response, Ruby declared she would save him and get him out of there. After all, everything that happened was her fault. He hadn't done anything wrong. It was an emergency. So she asked him to just trust her. The frightened boy had no other choice. He didn't understand anything at all, and he had no memory to make sense of it. Ruby decided to continue through the ventilation. Though her new friend worried she might have broken something, she insisted it was an emergency and she'd fix it later. Suddenly, Ruby froze for a moment, and the blonde thought something was wrong, but it turned out she just remembered they hadn't picked a name for him. After that, she instructed him to follow her lead and descend, going first herself. Ruby was surprised he didn't look scared at all, even though it was his first time. It turned out he was quite athletic, used to heights, and could even jump really high. Ruby grew more intrigued by his lost past. Then she opened the box to retrieve something and showed him a drone. It wasn't clear if he had seen one before or just didn't know what to say. But Ruby explained that it was Dune's drone, and she wanted her new friend to take care of it. Honestly, he was just bewildered and didn't know what to say. He had no right to it at all. What happened was because of him. Ruby tried to calm him down, as she knew Dune well and was sure he wouldn't blame him. And Lisa would definitely have buried Dune with this drone, but he wouldn't have wanted that. It would be a waste of a perfectly good drone. So Ruby stated she wanted him to pilot the drone instead of Dune. Suddenly, his mind went silent. He couldn't understand why this girl was being so kind when he had just killed her close friend. But something inside urged him to accept her generosity. Suddenly, his whole body trembled violently, as if struck by lightning. He pulled his hand away and asked Ruby to put the drone on the ground, not wanting her to be in danger because of him. Ruby suddenly felt so sorry for him. This guilt that had settled in his heart, it was such a heavy burden. But her optimism didn't waver. She offered him gloves. She was so sincere and empathetic, saying it would make him feel more at ease. A sudden warmth spread through his body, and the guilt seemed less overwhelming. After all, someone saw something good in him, not just a monster. Ruby added that the drone hadn't been painted yet, meaning it was colorless, just like the blonde, he joked aloud. Ruby found it adorable that he could see the positive in everything. Then she handed him a bracelet, although they were supposed to implant a chip in the brain, but she couldn't do that. Through the bracelet, he could also connect to the drone. The rest was up to him. He needed to practice to learn how to control it. Suddenly, the drone smoothly and precisely lifted off. Ruby couldn't believe it. Was this really his first time? She was so surprised she nearly forgot about the batteries. He had to keep them with him at all times since the drone ran on them. The less charge, the redder the lines would become, and eventually they'd disappear. He logically asked how to charge the batteries, and was shocked to learn they used pollutants that released a virus. But Ruby explained that in such conditions, they used everything. They also took 2 pills a day as a virus prevention measure. He found it quite ironic to use a pollutant as medicine. After that, he decided to play with the drone, trying to lift it a bit higher. Ruby thought about the adults' words. They said this boy was dead, but the bracelet and drone responded to him. Moreover, the pollutant, which emitted a virus whenever a zombie approached, was completely still and unresponsive. He was no different, alive just like all of them. In her thoughts, Ruby completely forgot something very important. Lisa! It seemed she didn't really like this girl much. But now, her fury was unstoppable. Was she going to expel Ruby? Tare couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was this a joke? But Lisa was dead serious. Ruby had helped a walking virus and was still with him. If they continued to meet, Lisa would consider labeling Ruby as a danger and banning her from Amina. Tare stood his ground, asking if Lisa had proof that Ruby was hiding an infected person. She had always disappeared before. But this time, Ruby hacked the camera and escaped through the ventilation. Did Tare really believe the newcomer could do that alone? Chills ran down his spine, realizing Ruby had indeed done something foolish. Suddenly, Lisa started shouting, furious at the little girl and blaming the men for always covering for her. Then she just walked away from them, ending the conversation. Tare trembled with fear and shock, genuinely worried about his niece. Bevrian showed no emotion. He was always quite silent. Meanwhile, events shifted to the hideout where Ruby and Dune used to hide from the adults. The new friend recognized the place. Ruby suggested they hide there for a while. She'd try to find something safer later. She wanted to say something about food, but the blonde interrupted, saying he didn't need any. After all, he ended up throwing it up anyway. He initially thought it was because he used to eat rotten food from the streets, but the same happened with the soup and bread Dune gave him. Then suddenly his voice changed, and he asked Ruby not to return to this place the next day. To say she was stunned would be an understatement. He apologized for taking her hideout, but explained he liked it there. But Ruby couldn't just leave it at that. Without realizing it, she started moving closer to him. But the blonde backed away, remembering to keep his distance. Ruby bit her lower lip, gathering all her emotions, then suddenly took a step forward. The boy began to panic. It seemed not everything in his body had died, and Ruby might see it if she got any closer. But she ignored what he was saying and just kept approaching, until he had nowhere left to run. Where did Ruby get so much confidence? And what was she trying to prove? She just pinned him against the wall, like a cat with a mouse. Ruby asked if he saw it too. Nothing was happening. She got very close. In the end, he couldn't take it and turned away, unclear if he feared infecting her or if it was something else. But Ruby only grew more curious, as she was already so close and yet nothing was happening. So she went further and touched him. It seemed something in him hadn't died and retained its reflexes. He screamed so loudly, like he had just seen a spider. Ruby stepped back, startled by his scream. She hadn't realized how carried away she'd gotten and crossed a line. He screamed like a girl and called Ruby a pervert. What, her? She was accused of groping his chest. The blonde ordered this pervert not to come near him again. But she hadn't done anything like that. Ruby felt so embarrassed. She didn't understand what she was doing. It wasn't supposed to matter. She was just curious. But in truth, the feeling of shame was drowned out by sadness, because Ruby learned his heart wasn't beating. Meanwhile, events shifted back to Amina. The ventilation in Ruby's room still hadn't been fixed, so she decided to return the same way without raising suspicion. Ruby wasn't worried at all, even though she had broken many rules and argued with everyone. Because of this, she didn't notice her father in her room, who immediately asked who told her she could come back here. This question puzzled her. You don't expect to hear that from your father. But it turned out he was talking about the smell. After disinfection, the room could still be dangerous. Ruby decided to turn it back on him, saying he shouldn't be there either. Bevrian suddenly smiled. In truth, he didn't want to come there either. Ruby felt embarrassed for some reason and apologized. Her dad seemed to ignore it and suggested they eat first and then take a walk. How could she refuse her father? Meanwhile, events shifted outside. Ruby's drone jittered and took off. It turned out that while it was on wheels, Ruby had no trouble controlling it even with her eyes open. But she couldn't handle the wings unless she closed her eyes. And honestly, she worried she wouldn't be useful in battle under such conditions. Many people said they couldn't control a drone with their eyes closed. So what was wrong with Ruby? Her dad made imaginary glasses for her and said she could see the drone's field of vision. She just had to be attentive. When she closed her eyes, her vision stopped working and focused on the drone's field of vision, meaning she was one with it. He agreed that controlling the drone with closed eyes was difficult for him too. He lost control when he couldn't see it. But Ruby had her own strength. Only she could do it this way. Didn't she understand that? Her dad repeated that his daughter had an incredible ability, and he believed that with this skill, she'd surpass her old man. Those words were like honey to her ears, spreading warmth through Ruby's body. She had missed it so much. A wonderful moment. She wished it could last forever. Meanwhile, a new day dawned, and the vent grate was broken again. This time, Ruby carefully unscrewed the grate, then descended the usual way. She didn't notice she was being watched. It was Tara and Bevrian. They weren't just watching, they were analyzing her actions. It was unfortunate Ruby only looked down. She was vulnerable from above. It turned out Tara often watched her, but it seemed Ruby still hadn't found the answer. So he told Bevrian to tell her everything. Tara trusted her because she was his niece. But if she were anyone else, he wouldn't allow her to stay, worried she might be infected. Then he gave Bevrian his medicine and water, and her father promised his daughter would be careful. But how did he convince Lisa? It seemed she finally calmed down, although she was incredibly furious. But it turned out it wasn't that easy. Bevrian asked for 3 days to say goodbye to Ruby. And then he promised he'd take care of her himself. Meanwhile, events shifted to the blonde's hideout. By the way, he still didn't have a name. Ruby found him in a stance as if ready to fight her. She had already said she wouldn't come near him again, and he was acting like a shy little girl. Then she pulled out masks and suggested they wear them. Meanwhile, events shifted outside. To be honest, he was worried even with the masks. They reached the first zone, even though they weren't supposed to be there. But Ruby said they had something to do. The blonde's drone was under control, and hers rolled on wheels. It looked like Ruby was walking a dog, quite amusing. Suddenly, she finally found what she was looking for. Ruby explained they needed to find as many pollutants as possible because there were few left in the first zone, and finding them in the safe zone was nearly impossible. Ruby was sure tons of pollutants were in the danger zone, but she couldn't go there. She got into big trouble just being near the entrance to the second zone, but she was told the second zone would soon be secured, meaning the land was gradually being cleansed. Suddenly, Ruby realized her new friend must have been in the danger zone. She was so curious about what it looked like there. He confirmed the fog there was indeed terrible, but Ruby was interested in the zombies. For some reason, this question made him fall silent. Then he suddenly moved closer to Ruby. He was very close, literally breathing in her face, and said she was looking at one right now. Then added that if she got too close again, he'd eat her alive, his voice suddenly changing as if he meant it. Then everything abruptly returned to normal, and the blonde, as if nothing had happened, asked what Ruby planned to do with the pollutants. It turned out she didn't plan to charge the drones, just wanted to collect them for now. Ruby wanted to help her father in any way she could. She chose the largest screwdriver she had. The blonde was stunned. He thought Ruby would be better off forgetting about helping her father and just not getting into more trouble. Meanwhile, Ruby had already pried off the first pollutant crystal. Her friend asked if her father collected these things daily, but it turned out Bevrian monitored zombies and other outcasts. The area had to be safe for others to collect them. While Ruby was busy with something useful, the blonde suddenly noticed something. A gun. For some reason, it caught his attention. Then he immediately got distracted, thinking they'd find many more pollutants in the second zone, but there would certainly be more zombies there. Suddenly, he remembered that strange situation with Dune. He was a zombie, but he didn't bother him at all. However, maybe everything would be fine if he went there. Meanwhile, events shifted back outside. Ruby was hiding and shouting to her friend that it was getting dark and they needed to return to the hideout. She waited for him to finally hurry up, so slow. Suddenly, Ruby saw something out of the corner of her eye. Although there was nothing there, for some reason, she couldn't look away. Ruby looked closer. Then suddenly, no, it seemed like nothing. Or maybe it wasn't nothing. A zombie in the first zone? What the hell? Ruby just froze in place, her eyes filling with tears. She hadn't been this scared in a long time. At that moment, her friend returned. It turned out he had trouble controlling his drone. At first, he didn't notice the monster approaching them at all. The mask suddenly froze, as if waiting for some action from the teenagers. They discussed this thing between themselves. He hoped Ruby knew the monster, or rather, hoped it was just an acquaintance of hers. Then as the thing got closer, the teenagers screamed like little kids. Suddenly it spoke in a very low and scary voice, calling for a brother. Then it extended something and beckoned them to come along. Brother? Who was it talking about? The teenagers pointed at each other, hoping it wasn't there for them. Then the stranger threw something on the ground that looked a lot like someone's head, and then suddenly swung a crowbar he had been holding all along. The teenagers couldn't tear their eyes away from what they saw. Even though they were terrified, they should have run, but their bodies wouldn't obey. Then with a whoosh came the familiar sound, like someone smashing a watermelon. Even red splatters flew everywhere. Blow after blow, it repeated, and the sound grew softer each time. Ruby covered her mouth with her hands, unable to comprehend what was happening, too scared to even look that way. What was he doing? What was he doing? It was like something out of a horror movie. Blood droplets splattered everywhere and all around, until suddenly there was silence, followed by the clatter of metal on the ground. This psychopath finally had his fill, tossed the weapon aside, and now just stared at the teenagers. He extended his hands towards them and called once more to come with him. The blonde suddenly shielded Ruby, ordering her to run, and said he'd take her gun. The maniac just stood there watching, not even approaching. The blonde blocked Ruby and threatened the psycho not to come any closer. Then they ran, and Ruby asked how he knew about the gun, but there was no time to talk about it. The psychopath remained standing there. Events shifted back to the hideout. The blonde said Ruby had to tell her father everything, But she refused and only said that the psycho's appearance meant she had to leave the safe zone. Suddenly, he grabbed her hand and squeezed it tightly, then leaned closer and said that person was very dangerous. He was just insane. But honestly, Ruby wasn't too worried about that. She thought the blonde would eat her. After those words, he quickly withdrew his hands, shocked by his partner's calmness. In the end, Ruby agreed to tell her father what they had seen. But now the blonde didn't care. He could finally collapse onto the bed and rest. Then Ruby decided to place the gun next to the bed. The blonde didn't expect such gifts. She explained that it was dangerous to walk around without a weapon, that Psycho could come back, and the magazine was full with extra bullets. Suddenly, the blonde asked a very dumb question, whether Ruby knew how to shoot. But that's a basic survival skill. Her dad had taught her long ago. Then her friend confessed he had never shot, well, didn't exactly remember doing it. Ruby was surprised, wondering why he even grabbed the gun, and realized why he hadn't even taken the safety off. He just wanted to scare. So Ruby ordered him to come over. She wanted to show him something. But her friend started acting like a scared little girl again. He threatened to eat Ruby if she got closer, to which she just nodded. The blonde realized he no longer scared her, so he agreed, and they began shooting lessons. Meanwhile, events shifted back to Amina. Bevrian listened carefully to his daughter, noting the distinctive features, a mask and a red scarf. Ruby was so energetic and quick in her recounting. She also mentioned a white coat and suddenly fell silent. Her voice began to tremble as if she was about to cry. Ruby said he was insane and was hitting a zombie with a crowbar on the head, blow after blow. Suddenly her eyes filled with tears, barely held back from flowing. Her father understood everything and just hugged his daughter. She didn't need to say anything more. Bevrian decided it was just a recluse with a mental disorder and promised to inspect the area the next day, asking where they had seen that psycho. Then Ruby hugged him tighter and shouted that she hadn't left the safe zone. Her dad pretended not to try to catch her in a lie. He decided to start the search from Zone 1 with Ruby's uncle. But if his daughter went outside again, he wouldn't be able to focus on the search. So Bevrian asked Ruby not to go anywhere at least the next day, and his daughter promised him that. Now her father could breathe a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the blonde's hideout. His watch was working, which meant he launched the drone, tried to reassure himself that everything was fine and soon he'd be able to shoot again. He looked at his drone sitting on the floor, and suddenly a great wave of sadness washed over him. He still doubted and wasn't sure if it was right that the drone now belonged to him. Then he started thinking about Ruby, wondering if she'd show up this time. Of course, it would be better if she didn't, but suddenly at that very moment, he heard footsteps. He tensed up and began to listen intently. The footsteps were approaching, confident and purposeful, as if this person knew exactly where they were going and what they'd find. The drone immediately ascended. Then he pulled out his gun. Those footsteps weren't Ruby's. He was sure of it. The door slowly creaked open. He swiftly grabbed his gun, ready for action. Bevrian! It was him! The two almost shot each other. When the teenager realized what had happened and who was standing before him, a few seconds passed. Suddenly he was asked if he intended to shoot, though his hands had already lowered, signaling a truce. He was puzzled by the question, but then denied it. Of course, he wouldn't shoot Ruby's father. However, it wasn't that simple. Since the teenager didn't want to shoot, Bevrian decided to. The blonde didn't even have time to react when he heard the click of the gun. And then the shot. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another place. Ruby climbed out of Amina as usual, descending with a rope. She noticed it was very snowy this time. Real winter was setting in. She thought she should bring firewood into the shelter. Speaking of the shelter, the scene shifted there. The door creaked open, and Ruby didn't notice anything unusual, loudly announcing her arrival. She immediately mentioned the blizzard outside and asked if her friend was cold. But there was no response, just silence. The room looked normal, as if nothing had happened. So Ruby didn't think anything was wrong. She just asked where her friend had gone. But again, silence. These games were starting to worry her. She sat on the bed and noticed a bag. And that seemed very strange to Ruby because he wouldn't have left his bag behind. Without a second thought, she opened the bag to see what was inside. Ruby immediately pulled out the familiar photo of that flower. Suddenly, she was overwhelmed with immense sadness and pain. She remembered how Dune comforted her, telling her not to cry, that she had to get used to such things, especially since Bevrian was worried about her. But she couldn't stop. The pain was too great for her. Dune decided that Ruby was too attached to people, just like her father. He added that he hoped she wouldn't act like this when he died too. Those words hit her like a shockwave. How dare he say that? What did he even mean? But Dune spoke seriously and calmly, asking her to do him a favor and not make him worry about Ruby when he was gone. After all, they lived in a world where even people like his father could die, and he wouldn't be surprised if someone else died the next day. But those who remained had to move on. Ruby couldn't let the dead stop her. Dune asked her to forget about the people who were gone and instead find a goal and strive for it. Find a goal. That boy didn't know his own condition. Otherwise, he wouldn't have followed them or would have been very careful to hide it. But if Ruby hadn't met him, Dune would still be alive. She decided not to lose him, to be more careful and take her friends somewhere safe to prepare for the future, to make up for all her mistakes. Well, in any case, Ruby first had to find her friend. Where did he go on his own? It was dangerous outside. The drone was also missing. Maybe he went to train? Suddenly, a chillingly familiar voice asked where the boy was. Ruby looked up and her body froze. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her self-defense instinct kicked in, and she jumped away from the window. The masked figure kept asking about the boy, assuming Ruby had hidden him somewhere. The girl started crying, sweating from fear, while the madman began shouting, angry that the boy had disappeared. Then, without much thought, he jumped into the room. He took a step toward Ruby while she couldn't even move a finger. And suddenly, he screamed loudly. He wanted to know where the boy was. Ruby covered her ears with her hands. She had never heard such sounds from a human. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The masked figure looked down. Blood started dripping from his body. Ruby glanced to the side, feeling a jolt through her body. A gunfight was the last thing she needed in this situation. She hoped it was her friend returning, but it was her dad, which honestly was even safer. Suddenly, the masked figure started laughing hysterically. That laugh was definitely that of a psychopath. Then several more shots followed, one after another. And then the psychopath just collapsed loudly to the floor. Ruby finally felt a bit of safety and began to calm down. Suddenly, the madman's hands started twitching. Too soon to celebrate. Then he stood up with a characteristic sound, declaring that these pathetic people couldn't defeat him so easily. Ruby screamed in fear. A new wave of terror washed over her. Bevrian was momentarily stunned but didn't lose his composure. Her father fired again. The masked figure was already approaching them. But it didn't work, so he fired another shot. And then Bevrian realized that shooting the body was pointless, so he had another idea. Aim for the head! A very loud shot echoed, reverberating in their ears for several seconds. The psychopath's body immediately fell backward. Ruby hid even more behind her father's body. She asked if the psychopath was dead, but her father didn't answer and just ordered her to stay put. He cautiously approached the body to remove the mask, which seemed to cling to that pile of decay. Bevrian couldn't believe what he saw. What was this? The skin of this madman was completely covered in rot, just like a zombie. Suddenly, Bevrian noticed something else. There was something on the other side. Oh no! What a horror! This was definitely not a good sign. The scene shifted to Amina, where everyone gathered to look at the mask. The barrel. Everyone's faces were frightened and shocked. Lisa was furious. She was at a loss for words, but she still asked where Bevrian found this mask. It turned out he hadn't mentioned the psychopath, but now he simply said that the mask's owner had infiltrated the safe zone. Not those scumbags! What were they planning this time? Bevrian explained that the psychopath was looking for the boy. Him again, Lisa flinched at the mention. He asked why they were searching for that walking virus. Then he told Lisa she should look into it, and quickly. Bevrian wanted to search for clues outside the zone the next day. The scene shifted to Ruby's room, where she was shouting to her dad that she was going with him. Bevrian said she already knew his answer. Ruby assumed it would be, of course, let's go together. But it wasn't, yet she stood her ground. Her father said her uncle wasn't going either, so he asked her to stay with him. Bevrian thought this would help the situation. But Ruby said she'd just follow her dad without asking for permission. Then she added, as if suddenly remembering, that she'd never been outside Zone 1, and then grinned widely. She finally wore her dad down. Bevrian came to tell Lisa all this, expecting her to be angry, but she was only slightly displeased that he allowed the child to go with him. He apologized. Lisa knew Ruby was a kind-hearted girl, and as talented as he and Milena, so she knew the girl would be useful. But still, she was a child, allowing her naivety and enthusiasm to control her. Right now, Ruby reminded Lisa of them before they made two mistakes, which was why they stopped accepting newcomers. Ruby didn't have many friends her age. Her father and uncle were always busy and didn't notice her, which was their mistake. Lisa thought Ruby wouldn't get into serious trouble as long as Dune was around. Suddenly, Lisa admitted that without Bevrian, she couldn't handle Ruby. She simply didn't have time for the girl and didn't want to leave her with Tyre, who couldn't refuse his niece. So Ruby had to be with her father, especially since it would make him much more cautious. Then Lisa finally asked what happened to that boy. Silence. Then Bevrian simply said he took care of him. Lisa was satisfied with that answer and didn't ask further. Meanwhile, a new day dawned. Ruby and her father left Amina. Tyre said in a very sad voice that he'd worry about his niece, then added that she wouldn't listen to him anyway. Ruby smiled to reassure him and promised to see him upon her return. Lisa said Tyre's drone would deliver supplies every 5 days, also instructed them to use the radio for location tracking, be careful, and warned that if the chip broke, they'd lose connection. Then she awkwardly punched Bevrian in the arm, wished him luck, and said she'd be waiting for them. It seemed she wasn't good at expressing her feelings. Finally, Lisa looked up and met Bevrian's eyes, asking him to be careful. Meanwhile, Ruby kept looking at that photo. For some reason, those flowers wouldn't leave her alone. They just drew her in. She didn't even understand what feelings they evoked in her. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Sector 1, but it was still within Amina's zone. They reached there quite quickly. The weather was still just awful. Ruby mentioned this to her dad, worried they'd get lost, but Bevrian kept checking the compass, so everything should be fine as long as she followed him. At that moment, the wind became so strong that Ruby couldn't see anything through her hair. Meanwhile, it was getting dark. The day was coming to an end. They found a place to rest and spend the night. Hot tea was perfect for warming up. Her father asked Ruby why she didn't just tie her hair back, but she said it kept her warm. But she promised to do it if the wind got stronger. So this wasn't strong wind for her. Her dad didn't pay attention and started sorting through the supplies. There was chicken and vegetables. Everything looked quite appetizing. But Ruby wasn't really listening to him, to be honest. Her father said there should be spare magazines in the drone, asked her to check. Everything was in place. Meanwhile, Bevrian lay on the floor, looking at something so intently that he began to yawn. It turned out her father was studying a map to find a shorter route. Ruby was surprised that their search had a specific goal. She thought they were just wandering around the outskirts looking for clues. Finally, her father admitted they were looking for someone. Ruby kept asking questions until she found out it was an old friend of Bevrian's. She kept asking, but her father asked her to rest and sleep. Ruby surprisingly listened to him, but still, something was bothering her. She asked where that boy had gone. This question puzzled her father, but he pretended it didn't. Then he asked what Ruby meant. The best defense is a good offense. And it worked. His daughter quickly turned away and said it was nothing, wished her father good night. She felt ashamed of her thoughts and that her father might find out about them. Then she tried to fall asleep. Ruby didn't even notice when she fell into a deep sleep, so deep that her dad barely managed to wake her. He lifted her up immediately and told her to look at something. His daughter barely opened her eyes. But it didn't stop her from seeing the monster casually walking past them. Bevrian knew his daughter well, so he immediately covered her mouth before she could speak. The zombie turned out to be quite dumb, as it neither saw nor heard them. And eventually, it just wandered off somewhere else. A wide smile appeared on Bevrian's face, and he wished his daughter a good morning. Finally, she was awake. Meanwhile, they had already reached the second sector of Amina's zone. There were many more zombies here. This was their territory. But they were all quite dumb and didn't pose much of a threat. The plan was simple. The drone would emit a sound signal, the zombie would react to it. Then it would be killed while its attention was focused on the drone. So even here, they couldn't let their guard down. Bevrian was a true professional, so Ruby was completely safe. Although she was still very scared, constantly looking around. Ruby asked her dad if his friend was in a dangerous zone. For some reason, Bevrian found this term amusing, but that person really was in what Ruby called a dangerous zone. His daughter felt uneasy. What was so funny? Her father said they were just in a territory not controlled by Amina, not quite right to call it a zone. Bevrian and the others just called it the outside world. Ruby was looking somewhere off to the side. Her father noticed she was often distracted. So Bevrian asked what she saw there, and Ruby flinched at his words. Her dad pressed on, saying she was constantly looking around and getting distracted was dangerous. He ordered her to just walk beside him. Ruby explained that she was just very excited because it was her first time. Bevrian noticed she was slightly lying, but pretended to believe her. Meanwhile, they had already reached the cathedral. The entrance was completely covered with contaminants. Here they had a green hue, indicating a large number of zombies. Bevrian noticed the crystals were glowing brightly, so there were definitely monsters inside. He signaled to his daughter to make sure she understood everything too. Ruby nodded. Then the heavy cathedral doors creaked open, indicating no one had been here for a long time. Bevrian was the first. He didn't rush inside, listening for sounds. Then they suddenly dashed inside, Ruby trying not to lag behind. They immediately hid behind a pillar. Her father took out Ruby's drone. Then he whispered to his daughter, instructing straight ahead, making a series of quiet sounds. Ruby's drone immediately buzzed. His daughter followed the command. Then it rolled to the end of the hall. Suddenly, the drone started flashing different colors and playing music. At this noise, the monsters that had been hiding appeared. Then the slaughter began. Zombie screams, a lot of blood. It was all Bevrian. He moved like a shadow, quickly running through those scumbags so they didn't even have time to notice or react. And now the cathedral was completely safe. Then Bevrian immediately called Ter on the radio and reported they had reached the cathedral. The men exchanged brief information about the general state of affairs. News. The doors were broken, meaning someone had been inside besides the 3 zombies. Bevrian had to check their stash, and he was there. No one had touched anything. There were 3 boxes, meaning they had a 3-day supply of food and other things for 2. Ter reminded them to take medicine and charge the drones. Bevrian agreed with everything when suddenly he noticed something and abruptly fell silent. His pupils suddenly widened, and his heart began to beat faster. Even Ruby noticed her father's strange behavior, which slightly increased her own anxiety. Had those scumbags been here too? The wall? The drawing was very large and red. There was hope it wasn't blood, but paint. Bevrian decided to check it. Unfortunately, it was blood. Then he told Ter, who asked whose blood it was. Bevrian hoped it was the zombies. Of course, both Ter and Bevrian were alarmed by such audacity, painting the cathedral walls with blood, but no one showed it. Then Bevrian promised to leave as soon as they charged the drones and said goodbye. Then her father asked for Ruby's battery. Suddenly he noticed something and a brilliant idea formed in his mind. He gave Ruby a cloth and asked her to wipe the blood off the drone with it. His drone blinked. Then it flew to a large contaminant and seemed to magnetize to one of the crystals. The battery immediately began charging. Meanwhile, Ruby started cleaning her drone. She didn't notice, but it turned out it was covered in blood. Ugh! But there was no choice. Bevrian suggested taking medicine while the batteries were charging. He said now they should take it 3 times a day due to the number of viruses. Meanwhile, the batteries were fully charged to 100%, so they quickly gathered their things and approached the door. Bevrian didn't rush to leave, called Ter, said they were planning to move on. Then he signaled to his daughter they could leave the cathedral. And the family quickly fled from that place, which involuntarily evoked fear. Meanwhile, night fell. The cathedral doors were well secured to prevent monsters from reappearing. Suddenly, someone creaked them open. One step. Zombie bodies lay everywhere in pools of their own blood. It was the mask. Was he back or was he following that family? After inspecting the entire cathedral, the psychopath noticed something. The cloth Ruby used to wipe the drone. In his dull mind, logical puzzles began to form. Then he looked at the drawing on the wall. He approached, seemingly interested in the same questions as Bevrian. That's why he ran his finger over the drawing to understand if it was blood. Zombie blood or human blood? He and Bevrian had a lot in common. Meanwhile, the family had already reached the border of the second sector. Beyond it was the outside world. Her father stopped and told Ruby it wasn't too late to turn back. He even promised to escort her if she was afraid to go alone. His daughter silently looked at her father, studying his face and holding the pause. Then she asked if she could go first to the border. A smile appeared on Bevrian's face. He seemed a bit relieved, as if this question was a kind of test. But he didn't allow Ruby to go first. Meanwhile, some time had passed. The wind was strong, almost tearing the map from their hands. Bevrian and Ruby stood by the doors of some building. Then her father knocked on them. A few seconds of silence followed. Suddenly the doors creaked open, but it seemed like they opened by themselves, not by someone. Then everything happened very quickly. A gun appeared from the opening. Then it was suddenly at Bevrian's face. Ruby screamed in fear, but her dad raised his hands and calmly said everything was fine. Then an old man appeared in the opening, asking in a harsh and unfriendly tone what they wanted. Suddenly, Bevrian began saying a strange sentence. Birds fly low, only before a storm. The man's eyes widened as if he hadn't heard that sentence in a long time, which was evidently a code word. He lowered his weapon and asked for a name. Bevrian gave the name Rowan. It seemed the man liked the answer, so he let them in, asking how Bevrian knew him. It turned out they were friends, and Ruby was in a state of shock. So they were seated at a table, and the man began offering tea or coffee, but Bevrian declined. The old man offered cocoa for his daughter, but her father held back again. Ruby quietly whispered to her dad that it wasn't polite to refuse like that. The old man chuckled, admitting that he liked Bevrian because usually young folks let their guard down just because he was an old man. But now he saw that Bevrian was definitely a friend of Rowan. He finally asked why they had come. It turned out he wanted to talk to Rowan specifically. Then the old man pulled a radio from his pocket, adding that the person they were looking for never stayed in one place for more than 3 days. Fortunately, he knew where he was at the moment. The old man then called himself Gray Mouse over the radio and asked for Hot Dog. Hot Dog responded from the other end, and the old man asked if Rowan was in their area. It turned out Rowan had been there just 3 days ago. A day ago, he was spotted in the Rhino District, which the old man mentioned was quite a distance from here. Bevrian asked the old man to show on a map where Rowan might be, and the old man started searching for his glasses. Meanwhile, night had fallen. As they were saying their goodbyes, the old man asked them to pass something on to Rowan. Now they were chatting pleasantly. The old man handed over some cigarettes for Rowan. After that, they left, and it had been quite a warm reception. As he closed the door, the old man noticed something. There was a chocolate bar on the table, but he hadn't left it there. He thought it must be from that kid, and it made him feel good since he couldn't remember the last time he got a gift. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. The old man figured the guests had forgotten something. So, without much caution, he opened the door and asked what they had forgotten. But it was all for nothing because standing before him was a mask. When you're surviving in an apocalypse, the most important thing is to never let your guard down. Because just one single mistake could cost you your life.